He was half unconscious when the guards dragged him in. They had beaten him relentlessly, snapped the already fragile bones in his arms, and left him howling in agony on a blood-stained floor. But in this bleak hour, John McCain clung fiercely to a single conviction. He would not accept special favors, even if it cost him his life. The North Vietnamese captors knew whose son he was. They knew that his father was a high-ranking admiral in the U.S. Navy, that this prisoner could be a valuable bargaining chip if they chose to release him early. All he had to do was say yes. The effort to stand, to breathe, even to think, was an excruciating test of endurance. Yet McCain's sole response, more a ragged hiss than a sentence, was no. The men beating him were stunned by his stubbornness. After a moment's hesitation, they continued the assault. That single refusal to accept special treatment was something few Americans fully understood at the time. If people saw John McCain as an admiral's son or a pilot with a peculiar flair for mischief, they did not yet see the unbreakable core of the man who would emerge over decades as both a symbol of unyielding patriotism and an unpredictable rebel in the corridors of power. And it all began in that dim, fetid prison room at the height of a complex and controversial war. The 1960s were turbulent times in America. The civil rights movement had ignited powerful questions at home, while overseas, a swelling Cold War tension drew the United States ever more deeply into the affairs of far-off nations. In Southeast Asia, Vietnam was ablaze. On paper, this was a proxy conflict between communist expansion and Western-backed South Vietnam. In reality, it was a swirling tragedy of cultural misunderstandings, flawed military strategies, and rising casualty lists that strained American morale. The conflict divided families, outraged young students, and fueled bitter clashes in Washington. Countless young men, often sons of working-class families, were drafted to fight in a humid land they'd scarcely heard of a decade before. Into this charged environment walked John Sidney McCain III, born into a Navy dynasty, determined to earn his place on the front lines. His grandfather, John S. McCain Sr., had commanded aircraft carriers in the Second World War. His father, John S. McCain Jr., would rise to be a four-star admiral and commander-in-chief of the Pacific Command. It was more than a family tradition. It was destiny, or at least it felt that way, to a young man with a streak of rebellion who had yet to make sense of that inherited legacy. John was born on August 29, 1936, in the Panama Canal Zone, a place then under American control where the U.S. Navy presence shaped daily life. An adventurous boy, he was often described as feisty, independent, and prone to testing limits. Even as a child, he sensed that certain doors in life might open more easily for him because of his last name. But he disliked being judged solely by the achievements of his father and grandfather. Perhaps as a result, he gained a flair for challenging authority. Classmates recall him as a paradox, at times charming and fiercely loyal, at other times hot-tempered and reckless. But if there was one thing that never wavered, it was his aspiration to become a naval officer. He attended the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, where he wasn't exactly a poster boy for discipline. He graduated in 1958, fifth from the bottom of his class. He racked up demerits like a hobby, frequently pushing the edges of academy regulations. Yet despite his low-class standing, the Naval Academy shaped his character in ways he would only appreciate years later, drilling into him an ethos of service and duty, even if he learned those lessons the hard way. Commissioned as an ensign, McCain moved on to flight training. He nearly washed out after a few accidents. In 1960, during a training session over Corpus Christi Bay, he managed to crash his aircraft, an incident that would be quietly noted but not widely publicized. Undeterred, he continued to refine his piloting skills. Colleagues remember him as audacious in the cockpit. He liked to push the boundaries, flying lower, faster, or with more flair than standard operating procedures allowed. Some of that was bravado, but behind it lay a keen sense of how fleeting life could be. In the early 1960s, the U.S. military was ramping up deployments around the globe. In Asia, the simmering conflict in Vietnam was on the verge of full-scale eruption, and McCain found himself assigned to an aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Tonkin, part of the great rotating cast of American forces attempting to contain the spread of communism. By 1967, the war in Vietnam was raging. The American presence was no longer limited to advisors and special forces. Massive ground operations and aerial campaigns were underway. McCain, a lieutenant commander by then, flew A-4 Skyhawk jets for the Navy. In July of that year, he narrowly survived one of the worst disasters in American naval history, the catastrophic fire on the USS Forrestal. A rocket accidentally launched from a nearby aircraft hit McCain's plane on the flight deck and triggered a series of explosions and fires that lasted hours. Many airmen died in the subsequent inferno. McCain was lucky to escape with minor shrapnel injuries. The experience left him with a searing awareness of mortality and a furious determination to keep flying. Rather than take the offered opportunity to return to a safer stateside assignment, he requested to be transferred to the USS Oriskany, another carrier operating off the coast of Vietnam. One comrade recalled McCain's rationale. He said he couldn't look at himself in the mirror if he didn't go back up in the air. That fateful decision led him to a bombing run over Hanoi on October 26, 1967. As he approached the city, enemy anti-aircraft fire riddled his Skyhawk, destroying a wing. McCain ejected, and in the chaotic descent, both his arms and a leg were broken. He plummeted into Trukbach Lake, nearly drowning before enemy soldiers pulled him ashore. A crowd of angry locals beat him, enraged at the daily bombings that had tormented their city. He was transported to Hualo Prison, infamously nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by American POWs. By that point, he was at the edge of death. The Vietnamese discovered his father's identity and saw a propaganda opportunity. They offered him early release, hoping to gain favor in negotiations. McCain refused, stating that prisoners captured before him had priority. The interrogations and torture escalated. Over the course of 5.5 years as a prisoner of war, McCain endured solitary confinement, repeated beatings, and psychological torment designed to break him. In one of his rare letters to his wife, Carol, he wrote only that he was in fair shape and holding strong. Fellow POWs later revealed that fair shape was a gross understatement. He was living in a perpetual state of untreated injuries, malnutrition, and constant threats. At times, even turning over in his bunk caused him to cry out in pain because of his unhealed fractures. Yet he and other POWs found ways to communicate using tapping codes through cell walls, sharing bits of hope. One lesser-known instance, rarely discussed outside certain veteran circles, involved McCain orchestrating a sort of chapel service by tapping out prayers and lines of scripture. Another prisoner, hearing the muffled taps, tapped back the only hymn he remembered in Morse code. McCain, tears pooling in his eyes in the silent darkness, counted it among the most moving services he'd ever witnessed. These small acts of defiance helped him resist the interrogators. The North Vietnamese sometimes used elaborate ruses to make POWs appear on camera, denouncing American bombing campaigns. Interrogators threatened to withhold medical treatment unless the prisoners cooperated. McCain eventually signed a coerced confession, an act that tormented him with guilt, for years. But in the eyes of many, his refusal to accept a privileged release had already cemented his status as a hero. That moral complexity, acknowledging the humiliating, desperate choice to sign a statement, but also standing firm in refusing special favors, would shadow him for the rest of his life, shaping an unusual blend of humility and defiance. When he was finally released in March 1973, McCain stepped off the plane at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, on crutches, battered, and 20-some pounds underweight. Yet he wore a faint, weary smile. He stood straight for the cameras as best he could. He saluted. The images were broadcast across the world. Thousands of miles away, in homes across America, families of the missing or imprisoned clung to hope, while critics of the war shook their heads at the mounting toll. Vietnam itself was already transforming into a war that many would view as unwinnable and morally fraught. In those raw moments, McCain became not just another returning POW, but a symbol, the admiral's son who could have cut a deal and didn't. It gave him a moral authority that he would use, sometimes unpredictably, in the decades to come. He had to spend months in rehabilitation. His injuries were severe. His right knee was permanently damaged. His arms never regained full range of motion, and he was plagued by episodes of intense pain for the rest of his life. During this time, he also struggled with the emotional fallout. He had missed years of family life. His children had grown while he was gone. He discovered that his relationship with Carol, strained by distance and each person's private suffering, would not recover. Beneath his stoic facade lay haunting memories. Perhaps for distraction, or perhaps because he refused to be idle, McCain enrolled in the National War College. Even as he was physically limited, he devoured reading materials on strategy, diplomacy, and the broader lessons of the Vietnam experience. He was no fan of how Washington had prosecuted the war, but he was equally critical of those who dismissed the sacrifices of the servicemen and women who had answered the call. By the late 1970s, after undergoing multiple surgeries, McCain eventually retired from the Navy with honors. His father had passed away in 1981, leaving a profound void. McCain wrestled with the question, what now? He could have opted for a quiet civilian life or perhaps a comfortable job as a consultant. But he had discovered a curious spark in politics. The personal illusions he once held, that wars were all about glorious battles and unambiguous heroism, had been stripped away in Vietnam, replaced by a deeper sense of responsibility and a willingness to question authority. Encouraged by friends who recognized that his name, story, and a certain personal magnetism could resonate with voters, McCain moved to Arizona and entered the political arena. In 1982, he ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Though sometimes scolded as a carpetbagger with no deep roots in Arizona, he won voters over with a direct, forthright style. And perhaps the intangible aura of the ex-POW lent credibility to his pitches about strong national defense and moral leadership. He served 2 terms in the House before running for the U.S. Senate in 1986, succeeding the legendary Barry Goldwater, a founder of modern conservative politics. This succession was no small thing. Goldwater was revered as a statesman, and McCain had to prove he wasn't just a famous name riding on sympathy. He did so through relentless campaigning, a disarming sense of humor, and an ability to connect with veterans and Arizonans who admired his outspoken stance. In the Senate, McCain quickly earned a reputation as a maverick. While he aligned most frequently with the Republican Party, he wasn't afraid to break ranks. One overshadowed moment of political principle came when he condemned certain legislative attempts to cut funding for post-war reconciliation efforts with Vietnam. Many Americans still harbored intense anger over the war, but McCain, alongside Senator John Kerry, a Democrat and a fellow Vietnam veteran, advocated for normalizing relations with the country that had once held him prisoner. It was a startling move, one that prompted some old-school hawks to accuse him of forgetting the brutality he suffered. But McCain believed that the healing process required engagement, not permanent isolation. He would eventually travel back to Vietnam in the 1990s as part of a fact-finding mission on the status of POWs and MIAs. Standing at Truk Bach Lake, the site where he nearly died, he looked across the water, remembering that terrible day. The local crowd recognized him and seemed curious more than hostile. It was an uneasy yet quietly profound reconciliation. Yet McCain's journey wasn't entirely defined by valor or universally applauded stands. Controversies dogged him, chief among them his association with the Keating Five scandal in the late 1980s. Charles Keating was a wealthy financier who owned savings and loans institutions that collapsed, igniting one of the biggest banking scandals of the era. McCain, along with 4 other senators, had met with regulators to discuss Keating's situation. Critics said these senators were doing a political favor for Keating, who had contributed heavily to their campaigns. Although McCain was eventually cleared of serious wrongdoing, the Senate Ethics Committee did reprimand him for poor judgment. It was a moment that cut deeply into his sense of honor. He publicly expressed remorse, acknowledging it had tarnished his reputation. That painful episode spurred him to become a vocal advocate of campaign finance reform, working with Democratic Senator Russ Feingold to limit the influence of money in politics. This cause put him at odds with many in his party who viewed such measures as undermining free speech. But McCain persisted. Just as in his academy days, when he bristled at being the admiral's kid, he now bristled at the idea that politicians should be beholden to large donors. In 2000, he launched his first bid for the presidency, presenting himself as a straight-talking reformer. His Straight Talk Express bus tours became emblematic of his campaign style. He won the New Hampshire primary in an upset over establishment favorite George W. Bush, appealing to independents and moderate Republicans. But the campaign grew combative, and Bush ultimately secured the Republican nomination. Some blame negative tactics used against McCain in the South Carolina primary, including rumors about his personal life and family. McCain's temper flared. He was outraged by the smear campaigns. His rebellion against party orthodoxy had won him devoted followers, but also powerful foes. He returned to the Senate, seemingly subdued, but not for long. When the September 11th attacks struck the United States, McCain became one of the most vocal proponents of a strong military response, supporting operations in Afghanistan and later voting in favor of the Iraq War. He believed that the post-9/11 world demanded decisive action. Yet as the Iraq insurgency dragged on, McCain voiced frustration over the lack of a coherent strategy. He scathingly criticized Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld for mismanagement. Critics on the left said McCain had been too hawkish, supporting an invasion that was based on flawed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. Critics on the right bristled at his condemnation of certain interrogation tactics. Drawing from his own experience with torture, McCain insisted on moral clarity. "This is not about them," he argued in a Senate debate. "This is about us." He opposed the use of waterboarding and other enhanced interrogation methods, speaking from a harrowing personal understanding of what it really meant to be tortured. This stance placed him in direct conflict with many in the Bush administration's inner circle, reaffirming his identity as an unpredictable presence on Capitol Hill. He tried for the presidency again in 2008, this time winning the Republican nomination. Facing Barack Obama in the general election, McCain struggled to navigate an economic crisis that had erupted late in the race. He attempted various strategies to reassure voters. In a surprising move, he selected Sarah Palin, then governor of Alaska, as his running mate. That choice galvanized conservative grassroots support, but alienated moderates who viewed Palin as inexperienced. Looking back, even some of McCain's closest allies questioned the wisdom of that selection. Indeed, controversies and missteps piled up. He lost the election, and though he delivered a gracious concession speech, many of his supporters felt a wrenching disappointment. McCain himself was haunted by second-guessing. People in his circle mentioned that he'd sometimes brood, wondering if he'd let down the country he had served for so long. Nonetheless, he refused to retire from public life. Returning again to his Senate seat, he remained a powerful voice on national security and foreign affairs. In 2013, he visited Syria to meet with opposition rebels fighting Bashar al-Assad. He called for robust American support, angering some who believed the U.S. should avoid deeper involvement. Even as an elder statesman, McCain's rebellious streak persisted. He famously clashed with President Donald Trump, who had belittled McCain's POW experience with the remark, "He's not a war hero. I like people who weren't captured." McCain, stung but not cowed, pointed to his record. Many Republicans felt pressured to side with Trump, but McCain stood firm, calling the statement offensive to all POWs. That was a line he never forgave or forgot. The tension culminated dramatically in 2017 during the Senate's attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. In a moment televised live, McCain, recently diagnosed with brain cancer, arrived at the Senate to cast a decisive thumbs-down vote, killing the Republican-led repeal effort. It was an act that outraged party leadership and delighted Democrats. He offered no apology, insisting that the issue required bipartisan consensus. That final year of his life exemplified, yet again, the defiant independence that had marked his entire story. Behind these high-profile showdowns and legislative battles were deeply personal struggles. McCain's experiences in Vietnam left him prone to nightmares. He rarely spoke about them, but friends note that into his 70s, he sometimes woke in a cold sweat. Loud, unexpected noises could startle him more than was typical. He also carried guilt over his failed first marriage. While both parties moved on in quiet moments, he confessed he felt he had failed Carol after returning from Vietnam broken and emotionally distant. His children from that marriage respected him, but had their own complicated relationships with the war hero who spent so many years absent in captivity. He remarried in 1980 to Cindy Hensley, and they built a family that weathered the storms of national campaigns and political life. Yet the scars ran deep. In private, he once told a close friend that war doesn't leave any of us the same, and he knew he was no exception. There were lingering controversies surrounding his war record, even from veterans groups. Conspiracy theories claimed he had been a songbird in Hanoi, offering valuable intelligence to the enemy in exchange for medical care. Those allegations have been discredited by fellow POWs and military investigators who testified to his extraordinary resistance under torture, but critics and fringe commentators persisted. Another area of contention was his relationship with the defense industry. McCain was an outspoken critic of wasteful military spending, yet some argued that he went too easy on certain contractors. He also pushed for expansions of American military power in conflicts that some younger politicians and activists deemed unnecessary interventions. To them, McCain's brand of robust interventionism was an anachronism left over from the Cold War. Historical debates about his legacy will likely revolve around these questions of whether he was too quick to see military solutions, or whether he was a principled guardian of global security who believed American inaction could encourage tyranny. In the grand tapestry of military history, John McCain stands out for reasons that go beyond heroism in the line of duty. He symbolizes a generation's painful lessons about war's moral ambiguities. He stands as a reminder that unwavering patriotism can coexist with sharp criticism of government policy. After Vietnam, he insisted that the U.S. must be judicious about sending its sons and daughters into conflict, even as he simultaneously backed aggressive approaches in the Middle East. In that contradiction lies the complexity of a man forged by captivity, seared by personal guilt, and determined to honor the memory of those who never returned. His work with Senator John Kerry eventually helped bring about normalized relations between the U.S. and Vietnam. In a sense, McCain, once locked in a cell in Hanoi, helped build a bridge that political leaders had long struggled to envision. That achievement, rarely emphasized in superficial coverage, remains one of the quiet triumphs of his career. His time as a legislator also left lasting marks on the Senate's institutional memory. He championed campaign finance reform at a time when few in his party dared touch the issue. He was staunchly opposed to pork barrel spending, exposing what he saw as boondoggles and unwarranted government expenditures. He fought for veterans' health benefits, aware that the psychological and physical trauma of war lingers well beyond the battlefield. But perhaps the most significant lesson John McCain offers is the notion that patriotism is not about blind loyalty, either to political parties or to public opinion, but about rooted convictions shaped by personal trials. The stance he took against torture in the early 2000s, insisting it was both morally wrong and tactically flawed, remains a pivotal voice of conscience for many in the military establishment. Even though he was never shy about praising the heroism of U.S. troops and intelligence officers, he fervently believed America should stand for higher principles that set it apart from oppressive regimes. In his final months, as he battled a virulent form of brain cancer known as glioblastoma, McCain entered a reflective phase. His mind returned often to those 5.5 years in captivity, how they had forced him to grow up, how they had stripped away the illusions of youth. He also reflected on the meaning of sacrifice. Far from the rhetorical flourish that politicians so often invoke, he had lived it, watching men die in the name of ideals they believed in, and he carried the weight of that responsibility each time he stepped into the Senate chamber. When he gave a speech in October 2017 after receiving the Liberty Medal, he warned against a half-hearted approach to global leadership, saying, "We live in a land made of ideals, not blood and soil. We are the custodians of those ideals at home and their champion abroad." Some saw that speech as a rebuke to isolationist currents in modern politics. Others saw it as the final battle cry of an old soldier who believed passionately in America's global role. Either way, it spoke to the force of character that had animated him throughout his life. As he neared the end, McCain issued instructions for his funeral. He wanted to be buried at the U.S. Naval Academy Cemetery next to his classmate and friend Chuck Larson. He invited both Barack Obama and George W. Bush, men who had defeated him in national elections, to speak at his service. He did not invite President Trump. Some criticized that as petty, others saw it as a final statement of principle. In the days following his death in August 2018, thousands of mourners filed past his casket at the Arizona State Capitol and later at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, paying tribute to the former POW, the senator the presidential candidate who had shaped so much of modern American political discourse. Eulogies poured in from colleagues across the political spectrum, citing his courage and candor. Critics also weighed in, reminding everyone of the times he championed policies they deemed disastrous. The interplay of admiration and critique was fitting. McCain never wanted to be lionized without nuance. He believed that scrutiny and debate were cornerstones of democracy. Ultimately, John McCain's significance lies in the space he carved between unwavering love of country and a willingness to challenge it. He grew up steeped in the traditions of naval service, earned his place through near-fatal captivity, and built a political career on the notion that leadership requires a blend of loyalty and dissent. For older audiences who lived through the tumult of the Vietnam era, his story might resonate as a testament to the resilience of that generation. The men and women who faced a war of staggering complexity, moral controversies, and cultural upheavals at home. For younger generations, he stands as an imperfect figure who exemplifies both the costs of militarism and the power of individual conscience. His legislative record, for better or worse, reflected a philosophy that America had a responsibility to engage globally, even if it meant confronting painful moral paradoxes. If there is a final lesson to be drawn from McCain's life, it might be found in that battered cell in the Hanoi Hilton where he refused early release. Duty, as he saw it, was not contingent on personal gain or convenience. Whether he was entirely right or wrong in every policy stance is a debate that will continue among historians, politicians, and citizens. But the stubbornness he displayed, nearly dying to uphold a code of conduct for POWs, reveals a core principle that helped shape him into a kind of patriotic rebel, willing to buck his own party, to risk popularity, to forego comfort if it conflicted with a certain moral logic. That defiance became something of a trademark, from the Naval Academy days through his final thumbs-down vote on the Senate floor. Maybe that is the ultimate takeaway. That true leadership emerges from the balance between duty and doubt, from having faced the worst that humanity can inflict, captivity, pain, betrayal, and choosing hope and service anyway. McCain's life reminds us that heroism and controversy often coexist in a single life story. He showed that one can be both a loyal servant of the nation and a fierce critic of its policies. He demonstrated that moral codes can hold firm in the darkest corners of a prison, and that the right to speak bluntly is earned through both sacrifice and reflection. He once said, "I fell in love with my country when I was a prisoner in someone else's." In that one line, he summarized the strange paradox of his life. He had to lose almost everything, including his physical freedom, in order to fully understand the weight of responsibility that comes with being an American. It was in captivity that he forged his deepest convictions, setting the stage for every rebellious stand he would take later. If modern politics often leaves us cynical, John McCain's story might at least illustrate how convictions forged in agony can transcend party lines and electoral calculus. And so, whether you view him as a flawed hawk or a principled statesman, or both, his tale stands as a uniquely American saga. The prisoner who refused to be released early, who returned to serve, and who spent his final years reminding the nation that it must strive constantly to live up to its loftiest ideals. His passing did not end the debates about his decisions, but he left us with questions that echo far beyond the 20th century war that made him famous. What does genuine service to country entail? Where do we draw the lines between moral imperatives and strategic necessities? And how do we reconcile our belief in American exceptionalism with the raw truths of conflict? In the face of such questions, McCain's life offers no simple answers, only the example of a man who wrestled mightily with them, sometimes losing, sometimes triumphing, but always returning to fight another day. And that, in the grand panorama of military history, might be more compelling than any set of medals or commendations. It's the story of an indomitable spirit shaped in captivity, wielded in the halls of power, and remembered by a nation still grappling with the war that defined him. Today, if you find yourself at the Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, you might see the headstone marked John Sidney McCain III. You may recall the controversies, the defiance, the candor of a senator with a crooked arm from years of mistreatment in Vietnam. You might recall his willingness to cross the aisle or his stirring calls for national unity. You might disagree with many of his votes, but if you stand quietly long enough, perhaps you'll sense the deeper echoes of that battered man in a Vietnamese cell who refused a ticket home, not out of pride, but out of duty to his fellow prisoners. A man who, in the darkest hour, chose to say no because he believed some things in life remain worth suffering for. If we can understand that fragile, steadfast conviction, we might glean a last glimmer of clarity, that beyond the slogans and the squabbles, beyond red or blue, beyond the uniform or the headlines, lies the solemn promise that service to country is, at its core, a deeply personal pledge to uphold something greater than oneself. And that, in many ways, is the legacy of John McCain, the prisoner who became a patriotic rebel. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.